Welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. We're diving deep into the intricate layers of the 7-stage generational wealth model to offer invaluable insights on legacy building, wealth accumulation and preservation, and financial growth across generations. I'm Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and this is the New Wealth Wave podcast. Hey, future wealth builders. Welcome to another episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast. Today, we are focusing on stages 2 and 3 of the 7-stage generational wealth model. To help lead the discussion will be Dr. Wendy Ashley. I had a chance to share the stage with Dr. Ashley on the 12th of September, and we were at the California Minority Council program. At the beginning of it, I knew that she was dynamic, but at the end of it, it was confirmed how dynamic she was. And Dr. Ashley, thanks for coming on today on the New Wealth Wave podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
I'm excited as well. So let's give you a little background on Dr. Ashley. She's a professor and chair of the social work department. Dr. Ashley received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Riacon College and her MSW from the University of Southern California. She's a licensed clinical social worker since 1998. And has over 29 years of micro, meso, and macro social work experience. Dr. Ashley maintains certifications in diversity and inclusion practices from Cornell University. She also recently published a book entitled Merging Social Work Practice and Anti-Racist Positioning, How to Be a Clinically Sound Anti-Racist Social Work Practitioner, published July of 2024. She is the author of multiple publications, speaks at conferences nationwide and internationally, and maintains a trauma-informed, anti-oppressive private practice and provides anti-racist training and consultation for multiple organizations. Dr. Ashley, welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast. If this is your first time tapping into the New Wealth Wave podcast, make sure you subscribe. Let me give you some background on the New Wealth Wave podcast. The podcast is based on my 7-stage generational wealth model, which focuses on 3 phases of our lives: the past, the present, and the future. Stage 1 is our internal and external ecosystem. Stage 2 is our financial genetic code, which we focus on financial trauma and anxiety. Stage 3 is financial healing, where we provide opportunities and avenues to reprogram your financial genetic code, which is a byproduct of stages 2 and 1. Stage 4 is financial edification, where we focus on financial literacy and financial inclusion. Stage 5 is financial well-being. That's where we're all trying to get to. This is where we focus on not outliving our income and having financial health, because financial health is wealth. Stage 6 is generational knowledge. This is where we came up with the term generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And this is where you create your financial footprints. And stage 7 is generational wealth. Now, Dr. Ashley, you had a chance to take a look at the model. What was your first initial thoughts?
My initial thoughts was that's a lot of model. It's a lot. Anytime you start to have to unpack and examine your own feelings about money, my initial thought was, scary, scary, scary. But then I got excited. Let me plot this out. Where am I at? What am I doing? So I was excited by it after I was done being scared.
Before we get to the heavy lifting, we always ask a light question to get things started. Tell your listeners and those who follow you, those who are going to be listening to the podcast that don't know a lot about you, tell us a fun fact about yourself.
You know, I'm a grown-up now, Dr. Wallace. People don't know that I used to be quite the athlete. In high school, I lettered in 3 sports. I lettered in volleyball, I lettered in soccer, and I lettered in track and field.
You know, I'm a fan of track and field. All 3 of my daughters ran track and field. What was your event?
Let me ask, can you guess what kind of track person? Am I a distance runner? Am I a long jumper? Am I a sprinter? What do you think?
Okay, so I would say a combination of either the short sprints and or a long jumper, maybe a triple jumper, but a long jumper in the short sprints.
Triple jump. You got it right on the front end. I am a 100-yard dash girl. The 100 was my race and the relay. I anchored both relays, the 100 and the 400. But yeah, the 100 was my race.
So I'm sure you had a great time watching the Paris Olympics.
I did, but I have to tell you, I'm still anxious watching track. Like running it, I was anxious. Watching it, I'm anxious. But Kari Richardson is my girl.
They give you a little something to watch if you haven't. Watch Speed on Netflix. It focused on the championship series in the track and field, the hundreds, the short sprints. And then they have part 2 coming out in November where they focus on the Paris Olympics as well. So you told us a fun fact about yourself. You explained what you thought about the model. And you said it was scary, curious, exciting, and inspired. We ask a three-part question. And this question sets the tone for the entire episode. Question number one, before you became an advocate in the behavioral science space, where were you on the 7-stage generational wealth model?
Before I became an advocate in behavioral social sciences, I was in my 20s. That was 30 years ago. So I would say probably in stage 2.
So in stage 2, you were looking at your financial genetic code. So you're dealing with a lot of trauma and some anxiety. Could you go into that?
Well, in my 20s, I was avoiding anything related to finances. I was avoiding making decisions. I was doing much more spending and really sort of operating out of the ways in which I moved under my parents' oversight. So I didn't really make a lot of decisions. I avoided a lot of decisions. That was my foundation in my 20s.
So the second part of the question was, what was your aha moment that made you realize that change was imminent?
There wasn't an aha moment for me. In my 20s, I moved from undergrad to graduate school, and then I started in the workforce and I started making real money. And again, wasn't paying attention, avoiding spending. Probably in my 30s, I got married when I was 30. My husband and I hired somebody to do some financial planning. And for me, that was where I was like, I can't just float around. Like I actually have to invest and commit and think about what I'm doing with my money. I think one of the first questions that financial planner asks is, what would you do if the other person wasn't there? Like, how long do you think your money would last? I didn't have any savings. I hadn't thought about it. I had bought my own condo and we were thinking about buying a house together. I realized that I couldn't afford the mortgage by myself. Having to face what I was doing and how I was planning and then thinking about kids was the beginning of me realizing I had to do something different.
There's always part in our lives that you realize a change needs to be had, especially when you start asking deep diving questions, because you never really realize that until the question is asked. I will say this, though, most people do not even reach out to financial planners to chart the path.
And listen, I am a believer. Not everybody is a spiritual person, but I believe things happen the way they're supposed to. It just so happened, one of my really good friends who was also a social worker was dabbling in financial planning, and she was super aggressive. And she was like, you should really let me come over. And it happened almost organically that she worked her way into my life. Had that not happened, I would have never sought out. I think things happen the way they're supposed to happen. This occurred at a time where I was really open to it and receptive, which you have to be as well.
You have to be open and accepted. That's a great point. So currently, in terms of the model, we talk about the 3 phases, past, present, and future. Right now, today, we're in the presence. So where do you find yourself at on the model today?
It's interesting. I want to say stage 7, but I'm not. I'm not in 7. I want to say I'm probably at a solid 5. I would say probably 5, just because I think I'm in a place of well-being. But the pandemic really made it clear that there was a need, like the idea of absorbing crisis and managing when stuff goes wrong and the ability to bounce back. For the first time, I'm in a more stable place in my life because my kids are getting older. I'm focused on the more knowledge and wealth piece, but I'm not at wealth yet. So probably 5.
That's a great point. So, future wealth builders, welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast. Today we have Dr. Wendy Ashley. If this is your first time riding the wave with me, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can be notified when we drop a new episode or trailer for an upcoming series. So let's talk about the questions now. What role do personal environments and community factors play in early shaping one's financial mindset and habits?
Well, they're everything. In the first stage, we're talking about the things that set the stage for who people become, right? So we're talking about culture, how families respond to children's needs, attachment stuff, basic survival stuff. And if we even talk about what created a foundation before that, we're looking at intergenerational or historical trauma. We're looking at epigenetics, all the things that created the soil that build people. And then once they grow, we're talking about family culture, people's individual identities, like who their gender is, who their spirituality is, who their race is, their culture, their ethnicity, their language, all of those, their gender identity, all those pieces. So we're starting to create a mix. And whatever you already have, if you add a little trauma to that, if you add a little anything, it really becomes a matter of, do people fit with their surroundings? Are they treated in a way that's going to make them grow in a healthy way? All of those things are the recipe for the coding that people get psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally. And then if you add finances on top of that, people grow up with an understanding of how money is supposed to be spent. So all of that is built in on the front end.
I love how you talked about it's the soil. So you have the soil and they're growing out of it. I love the research that you talked about the family economic issues in 2022 shows that there's a link between adverse childhood experiences and financial security as an adult. If you look at it from that perspective, we know about the internal, which I phrase as walls in. Now we look at the external, which is walls out. So you were talking about that soil. How do you believe that we know the internal, the culture, but let's look at the external when you walk outside the door? How does that affect you as well?
They're interrelated, right? So the research is about adverse childhood experiences. There was a study that Kaiser Permanente and the CDC did way back in the 90s. They found that when you have had some kind of trauma, it impacts the trajectory for the rest of your life. This is important because what they found in that study was that you don't get to adulthood without having gone through trauma. I think it's something like 80% of people, by the time they get to adulthood, end up with some kind of trauma. So what that does is it impacts your nervous system. It impacts your lens. Kids go to school. Kids interact with people with a different kind of lens. Let's say you grew up with no trauma. You go to school, you're ready to learn. You're ready to have friendships. When you have had trauma, it narrows your vision. Kids who have been through trauma aren't open. They're not learning things. They are trying to survive because the environment they came from has altered their lens. It's altered their physiology. It's altered their brain chemistry. How receptive people are to the outside world, how open people are to the outside world, how able they are to interact with the outside world is 100% impacted by where they started.
Could you talk about the 10 ACEs that was identified?
ACE refers to adverse childhood experiences. And Kaiser and the CDC, they developed this questionnaire. And there are 10 adverse childhood experiences that are measurable. The study that Kaiser and the CDC did was in, I think it was either Orange County or San Diego. Their population was predominantly white. Had they been in communities of color, this number would have been triple what it was. And they found a ton of trauma in these folks, even in that socioeconomic demographic. But the 10 ACEs were physical, sexual, or verbal abuse. The second is physical or emotional neglect. The third is parental separation or divorce. The next is family member with a mental illness. The next is a family member who is addicted to drugs or alcohol, a family member who is in prison, or witnessing a parent being abused. So those were kind of the 10 that they were looking at.
That's interesting because recently I'm working with a group and we're doing the workshop in terms of the 7-stage generational wealth model. We focus on stages 1, 2, and 3 from 18 to 24 young adults. The results from the questions we pose to them after the first 2 workshops is amazing because they talk about the verbal abuse that they've come up. They talked about some, in instance, parents were addicted to drugs, how they were couch surfing, not having an opportunity to communicate about money, because we know that's a very sacred part of a conversation that we just don't have. It's so emotional. And as they get older in life, they have no confidence in the financial system. So the trauma that you're speaking of is so relatable, although that study was done in a different population, different segment, different target market. Within the marginalized communities, it's even more exacerbated because, again, there's more issues and concerns that happen. When you look at walls in and walls out, as you mentioned, they're together and it affects us so much as we get older. Interesting point there. Second question for you. So how can individuals recognize and navigate internal ecosystem influences like social economic challenges or community norms that may impact their financial behaviors and long-term wealth building potential?
One of the things you just said that really resonated with me was about unpacking parts of people's childhood experiences. When you've been through trauma, it impacts how you see the world. It impacts your level of hopefulness. It impacts your receptivity to people, your ability to trust people. It impacts relationships. But the other thing it influences is your relationship with money. So if you are couch surfing, if you are dealing with housing instability, you have a different relationship with money. If you have a parent that has a mental illness who can't consistently work or bring in money, you might be worried about when your next meal is. What happens is there is almost a built-in relationship with money, whether it's a poverty-based relationship, whether when we have money, that means we get a special dinner. Like my husband always talks about how when his parents got paid, they would go out to dinner on payday. Payday meant a special dinner. When I was a kid, My mom was a single parent, so I couldn't go to the pool with my friends. It was only $1 and we didn't have that extra money. You know what I mean? So money really is tied to a lot of things. Part of your question is unpacking not only these experiences, but also recognizing that they are intricately connected to our relationship with money. Were you able to get the jeans everybody else got? Were you able to get the Jordans everybody else got, right? Like those are all very real associations. A piece of this for all of us is recognizing you don't get out of your childhood without some scars, without some bruises. We have to recognize those and figure out what we want to do with them. I think for many people in marginalized communities, we have learned to just ignore it and keep on pushing. Like that's sort of the expectation. And just you got to know that if you do that, it is going to continue to restrict and limit your financial awareness as much as your emotional awareness.
When you look at it from that perspective within marginalized communities, we don't talk about money because in most cases we don't have it. That's our
Right.
reality. But in our minds, that is our therapy, right? Because we don't really talk about it. We're avoiding the situation. And so when we don't talk about it, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But in actuality, it's not, because there's so many landmarks, there's so many flashpoints that come in front of us that constantly remind us of our childhood. And some of the issues that we find when I'm meeting with clients, they will always go back to their stage one, regardless if they may be in their stage 5. I mean, they may be doing really, really well, but in their mind's eye, something may occur and they always go back to their stage 1, which ultimately affects them in terms of investing, in terms of participating in qualified plans at work, because they have a loss avoidance where they put more emphasis on losing $100 versus gaining $100. It's more emotional.
And listen, let's dispel that mythology right now. Avoidance is not therapy. That is not therapy. And I realize there's a ton of stigma in Black and brown communities about therapy. I get that. And I get that it is a very Eurocentric practice that people don't feel has cultural relevance. I understand that 100%. There's a lot of different shifting in therapy these days, but I get it. That is a defense mechanism. Avoidance, suppression, denial, those are defenses. The reality is that defenses do a good job of denying or distorting your reality, but to your point, they don't get rid of it. It's right there. So even if you're acting like it's not right there, it's there and it's going to impact your lens 100%.
So you mentioned some of the things you can do. You said there's a wrong way and a right way to go through this. Talk about those.
The wrong way is avoiding or ignoring. So many people ignore or avoid, or they compartmentalize. I'm just going to put this in my savings account. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to financially plan. I'm not going to do a retirement. So many people are 65 and have no retirement because people don't talk about it. They don't think about it. Unpacking this the right way is to face it, to look at it. And that means finding a way to deal with it. I am not a believer that therapy is for everyone. I am a therapist. I love therapy, but I don't think that everybody does. And if you are fighting it and you don't believe in it, then it's not for you, at least not right away. But you got to find a way to face your past. For most people, that means creating a space where they can look at it. Whether that means you're writing it down in a journal and you're reflecting on it, maybe you're having an open and honest dialogue with a partner, a spouse, a friend, a financial planner. You got to be looking at it and probably talking about it with somebody. You could read books. Amazon has every book in life. You could be looking up finance. There are workbooks on finances. You could listen to this podcast. You could read articles. You could seek therapy. Here's the line of demarcation. If this conversation makes you feel elevated, activated, flooded, if you feel uncomfortable, immobilized, if you feel avoidant, if you feel depressed, and if you feel anxious, then those are reasons that you probably should talk to somebody who's a professional.
What's the initial pushback that you get?
It's funny. People don't ever come to therapy about money. I mean, unless they're couples. Couples come to therapy about money all the time. But individuals come to therapy typically for relationship stuff. The pushback is frequently, I don't want to do this. I don't want to have to talk about this. I don't want to need this. I don't want to need anybody else. And then the second thing is, how long do we have to do this? When is it going to be over? When is it going to be better? And what people don't realize is that just like your relationship with your past is part of the struggle, your relationship with your family, your relationship to your childhood, your relationship to money, you got to develop a relationship with me, which means that this is not a fast result, that this is a process and it's going to take some time.
So you mentioned that couples usually utilize your services, and they do speak about money. What are some of the issues that you find when it comes to your practice talking about money?
Money is always an issue, but it's not what they come to the table with. The three biggest things that bring couples in are communication, sex, and money. But they don't talk about sex and they don't talk about money. What they talk about is how they can't find common ground. They talk about how they can't communicate and like lack of emotional reciprocity or seeing each other emotionally. Frequently, money is a part of it, and frequently, sex is a part of it as well. The initial piece, often dealing with communication, because without that, we can't get to the other things.
My theory is that when you have two people in a relationship, they're both coming from different stage ones and stage twos. And so when they become in a union, they're going to have some money issues because they don't know how to communicate about it. As you mentioned earlier, it's something that they need to communicate about, but they're coming from different backgrounds. And without having that information, you really don't know the personality of your partner.
100%. And there's sort of two parts of this, right? There's how you deal with it yourself. And then there's how you deal with it interpersonally with somebody else. So, like if you and I are in a relationship and I have my own stuff, my own trauma, my own experiences, as do you, there's that. And then there's how do we do this together? I can't even tell you how many people have been married who never talk about this or who do it in a very cursory, superficial way on the front end, but never really get into some of the depth of like, what is my relationship with money? What is my experience with it? We don't dedicate the time that's necessary to talk about this. And it's not just like, what is your experience with money? It's like, what is your relationship with it? How do you see yourself interacting in our relationship? And how do we plan from here? People don't do that. And they're not ready to do that frequently.
A good friend of mine who I've known for years, and they've been married for, I would say probably 10 years now. We was talking about the podcast. And one thing that she said to me that, I make my own money. I don't need him to tell me what to do with my money. Now, the interesting thing about it, they have been married, but they have no estate plan.
Wow.
They have a life insurance policy. She has a policy. He doesn't because he has some pre-existing illnesses going on. But her theory was that I make all the money and he doesn't really know about financial obligations. So
Right.
if something happened to her, he would know what to do. I said, that's not a healthy relationship.
Nope.
You have to be in concert with one another. She said, I think you're right. I think I need to kind of bring him in my ecosystem because he needs to know everything that I have, because if something happens to me, how is he going to be able to navigate through that? And you find that a lot.
Totally. Well, and you're talking about honesty, right? You're talking about transparency. We got to be able to talk about how much money we make. We got to be able to talk about how much money we spend. We got to be able to talk about what our agreement is, what our objectives are, and how are we going to budget accordingly. People come in with secret accounts. They maintain private funds. They have checking accounts the other person doesn't know. Like there's all of these secrets. I spent $1,000 today. I didn't tell my partner. There's no agreement. And that's huge. Have you ever heard of John Gottman? John Gottman is a therapist and a researcher. He has been able to ascertain with 90% accuracy whether a couple is going to break up or stay together. And what he says, the majority of couples break up between the 7th and the 10th year due to high conflict, or after 25 years due to drifting away from one another. I would be willing to bet that a big piece of the 7 to 10 has to do with some of the stuff you're talking about.
Send me that book.
Him and his wife do a lot of stuff on relationships. We could do a whole podcast on that because that is magical.
We may have to do one on that as well. But no, that's interesting stuff because I can use that in my practice when I'm speaking to my clients. The more information I have, the more I can provide that information to my clients. Interesting stuff. So another question for you. How can trauma and systemic challenges impact an individual's ability to progress through the stages of the generational wealth model from earning to wealth transfer?
One of the things you and I have been talking about consistently is trauma. Like you were describing a little bit ago, things happen in people's lives that activate trauma. Trauma is almost like a fire. You have your trauma in the past, and then you have things that happen in the present. What happens is, let's say I was assaulted as a child by a man with a beard, and that's by childhood trauma. And then in 2024, I'm walking down the street or I have to work with somebody who has a beard. I'm in close contact with them and they say or do something that activates me, right? So it happens in the present, but it lights up all of the history, right? It goes all the way to the past. So it's like a firestorm. I gave a sexual assault example, but it happens about a number of things, right? Because the way that the nervous system is activated is through stress, through threat, through fear. So people get activated. So it brings up all of these things. And what happens is they get immobilized, fearful, avoidant, disconnected. This is the important part. When people are dysregulated by trauma, they are unable to use the logical, executive functioning, thinking parts of their brain. So all they have access to is how do I get out alive? They don't have access to, let me creatively think about a financial well-being plan, or let me think about getting resources to manage this. No, they're thinking about how do I survive and not die? And that is a very different, that's not a growth mindset. That's not a financial well-being mindset. That's a survival mindset. So when we start to think about people's life circumstances that activate all of this, they can really create traps that people get stuck in regarding money.
Deep, interesting information. I knew that you were going to be good. I've been waiting for this day for quite some time. I mean, you've done a great job. Thank you again for coming on. So another question for you, Dr. Ashley. So how essential are cultural competence and mental health awareness in the financial edification stages of the 7-stage generational wealth model, especially within communities that face unique systemic barriers?
100% essential. I don't use the words cultural competence anymore because it's a little bit of an antiquated term, because the idea of cultural competence is that someday we're going to get competent. And the reality is we're not going to get competent ever. So the language I use is cultural humility. Like, how do I interact with people at a level that respects and honors where they're at, that centers them rather than my own worldview? But I think the thing that we're talking about is the reality that people have to have a level of cultural humility. They have to have mental health awareness, because the reality is all of this is tied to people's cultures. All of this is tied to their mental health. If you had a parent that had mental health issues, that is activating or dysregulating. If you have mental health issues, which, let's face it, it's 2024, everybody's not right. The world is completely on fire. If people don't have this, their ability to connect, their ability to engage, their ability to collaborate, their ability to provide services and support to communities of color is going to be impacted.
So let me ask you, how does social media play in this whole thing here?
Oh my God. I don't even know that we have time for that. There's a quote that says, comparison is the thief of joy. One of the problems with social media is that it has created a fantasy world. In social media, everybody is beautiful, everybody is happy, everybody is wealthy, everybody is living their best life. What people do is they look at it and they feel bad about themselves. It reinforces what people don't have. And it reinforces a sense of shame and FOMO. People feel like they're not worthy. I have clients that stay in a spiral of depression and anxiety because of their relationship with social media. When I look at their social media, I'm like, this is not true. You are not happy. Like, you are miserable. Yet they curate a life that is what they want it to be. I just think that it doesn't help people's mental health. One of the big things that a lot of my clients have had to do is go on social media breaks, or limit the amount of social media exposure, or create a internal way of establishing mindfulness for themselves so they don't get caught up in the fantasy that is social media.
That's interesting, because social media is everywhere. And I'm sure when you meet with your clients, you see their stories and their pages. You're like, what are you doing? This is not you. But there, again, the fear of missing out, keeping up with the Joneses. That's one of the things we talk about in the financial world.
Come on. I go on vacations, I go to dinner, and people are like videoing. People go to dinner and they don't talk. They're on their phones. People go on vacation and they're like, they're not enjoying the island. They're curating an experience about the island that's not even real. So there's a lot of information on social media. There's a lot of truth. There's a lot of access to resources. So I don't want to minimize those pieces, but I also think it's a setup for people to really believe in some of the nonsense that people are trying to create and portray. I really think that for folks that are dealing with their own traumas, their own histories, their own stuff, they have to recognize that people are creating something that they prefer, not necessarily reflecting something that's real.
Another question for you. Stage 2, the financial genetic code. How can families identify and shift inherited financial behaviors or beliefs that may limit their wealth building potential across generations?
I think that people have to start by really being curious about what their relationship with money is. Are you avoidant of money? Are you like super obsessed with money or worshiping money? Are you like vigilant? I love that you use the word vigilance so much because I'm a fan of 80s and 90s rap music. One of the phrases they would say in 80s and 90s rap is, let's keep it real, you come second to my money. That was like the thing, right? Money comes first, and then I'm vigilant about it, and then everything else is second. So I just think that people have to do some digging, maintain a level of curiosity about what their relationship with money is in the present. Ask yourself some questions. If I look at my parents, what was their relationship like with money? How was money spent? Was money talked about? How was money saved? Were we encouraged to save money? Did my parents talk about saving? How did I learn about money? And what was it like with my grandparents? What was it like with my relatives? How were birthdays celebrated? How were holidays celebrated? Did we give gifts? Were my basic needs met? All of those are important because if you're going to navigate where you go, you got to have some clarity about where you came from. And you got to have some understanding of where you're starting so that you can really set realistic and clear objectives.
When you talk about money worshiping, you find that a lot within the marginalized communities.
I was listening to something with Kanye a couple of days ago, and he was talking about rather than save my money or buy an island, I'd rather buy like 186 gold chains. We'll be living in an apartment, driving a Bentley. I really think that showing that we have money has been something that many of us have struggled with for decades. People with dominance, men, people with legacy, they don't buy a Louis Vuitton bag. Or if they do, it's not the one with all the logos. Money is spent, regarded, saved, and invested very differently in dominant cultures in a way that we're not taught to do in marginalized or minoritized communities. I kind of feel like I missed out. I got a white mother and I still don't know how to do this stuff. I don't have any of that access.
I knew when we met on the 12th in person that we were just going to have a great relationship. We are connected at the hip. The panel that we were on was so interesting because the panel was positioned as financial literacy. And Javier was the moderator, and both of you and I were on the panel. Afterwards, people were like just moved. They were like,
Yeah.
this was way more than just financial literacy. We're going to do a part 2 next year in San Francisco. We could really dive into it and change the title of it as well, because there was so many people coming up to me, and I'm sure you as well, saying that they wish they would have been there. And we touched on so much more than just financial literacy in the whole mindset, the holistic approach, so to speak. I have the model, but you're bringing the other side to it as you bring it into reality and shows how powerful it can be. So I am very excited about that. So stage 3 focuses on financial healing. What practices or approaches do you suggest for individuals to heal from past financial trauma and create a healthy relationship with money moving forward?
The thing that you and I have come back to over and over in this conversation, as well as the one on the panel, was that you got to know what your roots are, right? You got to know where you come from. You got to know what those relationships are so that you can make some very clear decisions. I really do think that first and foremost, there needs to be an awareness of where you're activated and where you're reactive, right? People have got to be able to know when they're dysregulated, when they're not right, when they're overwhelmed, when they're starting to go to avoidance mode, so that you can do some things. You can do some mindfulness. You can do some grounding activities to self-regulate. You got to be able to do that, or else you won't be able to make good decisions for yourself. I think that's a huge one. I also think that people need to learn how to explicitly communicate. Let me say that again. Explicit communication. You want to go on a vacation? I don't know how much you want to spend on it. No, it's, I have this much in savings. I kind of want to buy some things. Let's talk about what our agreements are around our spending. Let's talk about what our objectives are. I would like to purchase a vacation home. I would like to purchase a home. I would like to buy a new car this year. Let's talk about what you want to, let's negotiate. Do we have an agreement about how much we can spend on our own without talking to the other person? I can't tell you how many people I know who drain each other's bank accounts and never talk about it. That's a betrayal. I know people right now are like, I don't want to tell that person about how much I'm spending. That's my money. Okay, then you need to be single. Because if you're going to be in a relationship and you're moving towards financial well-being or health or wellness, you got to be able to be honest and transparent about what your spending is. So that's a piece. I think that therapy is a big deal and you are good at resourcing. Like there's a lot of levels. Like, do you need a financial planner? Do you need a financial analyst? We can't do this alone. One of the stories I said on the panel was that I was in the bank moving some money and the teller was like, you should put your money in a CD. Do you think I knew what a CD was? I'm 50 years old and I never heard of what a CD was. And I was like, what is that? She was like, girl, what you need to do is such and such. Do you think my family told me about that? Right? So we need resources. If we were not exposed to this through legacy and through family connections, whether the resources are therapy or financial, whether the resources involve mentorship, recognize that there is a lot of stigma and shame about help seeking in Black and Brown communities. Find somebody that you can trust. There are plenty of people out there. People don't want to go to therapy because they don't want to see somebody that doesn't look like them. There is a therapy for Black men website. There's a therapy for Black girls website. There's a lot of places where you can get resources. If you need to get some trauma therapy, there's a lot of places that you can go. But here's the thing. Recognize that you can't do it alone so that you can find somebody to partner with you.
I love that answer because again, when we was on the panel, we was talking about that. And then we concluded the panel, as you recalled, I said there was 5 different type of financial professionals that they're out there. And I love how you dived into that, but let's go over them. So you have the financial counselor, you have the financial educator, you have the financial therapist, you have the financial advisor, and you have the financial planner. 5 different people. Now, as you mentioned earlier, your example about not understanding what a CD was. That's a great conversation to have. But in your case, you probably need a financial educator just to give you the origins of those specific financial vehicles, because then you have a better idea of what you're doing. Oftentimes, as you mentioned earlier, somebody may come to me from a financial planning standpoint, but they have financial trauma.
Right.
So we have to move all the way back and get them some therapy, because if you don't get to therapy, it's going to be virtually impossible to move forward, because you're going to always have those flashpoints, those things that came up when you was a child, and you're going to be analysis by paralysis. You're not going to be able to move forward. In essence, you may not even trust the person that you're working with.
Right. And I think that's a piece of it. People have to really expect that this is relational. You need to have relationships with these financial people. People want a quick fix. How do I do this? How do I make money? This is a complicated conversation. So you got to work through some stuff in your relationships with yourself, your relationship with the people that you came from, your relationship with your partner. You got to be able to trust these people that you're working with. If you don't trust them, find somebody you do. If the people who were supposed to take care of you hurt you, that's a real tough way to start this life. It's tough to start this life knowing that the people who are supposed to and do love you harmed you. So then it becomes hard to trust other people. You got to know that if that's your wound, it's going to take some time.
Absolutely. And you find that a lot within marginalized communities. Something may have happened with their parents, their grandparents, and all of that information. I say that it's generationally willed upon us, unbeknownst to us. Right. So we're receiving all of that past trauma, and we may not be getting it verbally, but we're witnessing it, we're watching it. And it comes from years and years of your parents watching their parents. And so generationally, these things happen. They're passed down unbeknownst to us. And guess what? We are now the product of that. And at some point, someone has to break the cycle.
Right.
Once you break the cycle, it takes a lot of effort to do so. When you're talking about financial well-being in a relationship anyway, even within a relationship, you have 2 people with different ideas of financial well-being, which is important as well, too. So now when I'm getting to that part in our lives of retirement, my idea of financial well-being may be different from your idea from financial well-being. So that's a struggle as well, too. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree with it 100%. I mean, I think this is why explicit communication is important. When I see couples, I will tell them that developmentally, every few years, you gotta revisit this and re-up. It's like updating your operating system. When you get married, you're gonna have a very different set of expectations than you do when you first buy a home. You're gonna have a different set of expectations when you have children, if you have them. After 10 years, when the kids are teenagers, there is a renegotiation that has to happen every so often where we sit down and say, where are you at today? Because I am thinking now that I want to add on to the house. I am thinking that I want to retire at this age. Well, I want to eliminate our debt. If you're saying, but I want to travel more, I want to go on more vacations, how do we negotiate? How do we resolve that? How do we move forward managing what are the things that are most important to each of us that we can agree upon together? And those are not easy conversations. Because of that, people avoid them. It's a real thing.
I mentioned in terms of financial well-being, you have to give yourself realistic expectations.
Yeah.
Because once you give yourself realistic expectations, then it takes a lot of pressure away from you as well. Some people just say, hey, you know what? I just want to be able to retire and travel, live in a boat,
Yeah.
make sure I have my financial health. Because at the end of the day, regardless of how much money you have, if you don't have financial health, it's going to be a miserable time for you.
And when you get older, you get more vulnerable, and illness. One of my dear colleagues just dropped dead young, watching people die. It is very clear to me that this time is not promised. So like planning, like you were talking about earlier, I said to my husband a few years ago after I had a major surgery, I don't know what to do if something happens to you. Where are your bank accounts? Like, do you know where mine are? So like we really started to plan in a way that I just think people don't talk about. You're right. We got to do better at this.
I love that explicit conversation. You know, there's three things that I focus on when I meet with my clients: living too long, dying too soon, or becoming disabled along the way.
Oh my
Those
God.
are three things that you have to focus upon. And if you can do that, it eliminates so many problems. But, you know, when I mention that to them, some of them get afraid because they
Yeah.
haven't been able to do those things. Interesting conversation. Future Wealth Builders, thanks for tuning in to our podcast with Dr. Wendy Ashley. If this is your first time riding the wave with me, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified when we drop a new episode or trailer for upcoming episodes. So final group of questions for you, Dr. Ashley. Again, this has been a wonderful conversation. We may have to bring you back to talk about the behavioral, the relationships, and all that good stuff as well. So final question for you, Dr. Ashley. What do you want the listeners to take away from this podcast?
Such a great question. First and foremost, I want them to take away from this that their relationship with money has a lot more to do than with just money, that it has a lot to do with their history, trauma, attachment, families and their cultures and their childhood. So first and foremost, it's bigger. There's a lot of psychological elements to it. Second, you can't heal and repair by yourself. We get injured because of relationships. So that means that our wounds are relational, right? You could fall on the street and skin your knee, but that's not trauma necessarily. You're traumatized because somebody hurt you or neglected you or didn't show up for you, which is relational. So we have to develop relationships and have relational connections to heal. And the other is that, listen, brown people, black people, beige people, white people, you don't got to be crazy to seek therapy. Therapy today is very different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I'm here as a provider to say, you can find the people that are in your community to get therapy that's quality, that's culturally responsive, and where people speak your language.
So, Dr. Ashley, on that note, please provide your contact information if someone would like to gain your services.
Well, my website is drwendyashley.com. You can go there, or wendyashley.com, because I have both. That's my website and it has all my information on it.
Dr. Ashley, again, we'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come on to the New Wealth Wave podcast on behalf of all of our New Wealth Wave listeners, future wealth builders, our producer, Ray Haycraft, and myself. As we always say, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. We'll see you on the next episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us on the New Wealth Wave podcast, hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. Our show is edited and produced by Ray Haycraft. To dive deeper into the world of financial wisdom and learn how to create your financial footprints, head to our website at www.drjwallace.com. For more updates and exclusive content, connect with us on social media by searching Dr. Joaquin Wallace. And if you have questions and comments, feel free to email us at thenewwealthwavepodcast@gmail.com. Remember, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And as always, thanks for listening. The content presented in this podcast is strictly for educational purposes and should not be taken as investment advice. The views and opinions expressed by our guests may not necessarily reflect those of the New Wealth Way podcast and its host or producers. Listeners are urged to exercise discretion and judgment before making any financial or investment decisions. Always consult with a financial professional or advisor before taking any action based on the content of this podcast. If you're enjoying the New Wealth Way podcast, we appreciate if you leave us a review. We're always open to topic suggestions and guest recommendations. Feel free to reach out to us directly with your thoughts and feedback. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the New Wealth Way podcast.